Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of just all the stuff that's going on in the 1800s after 1848, right? So we're in a very pivotal moment in European history. Not the most riveting moment in European history, but we're still in a very pivotal moment all the same, right? We got to get through a couple of big things before we move on to something very, very important next week that will 100% be on your test, right? The big thing we'll be moving on next week is, of course, to the unification of Germany. Einigung von Deutschland Teil 1. Now, the big thing about it, though, when we're looking at it, though, is that there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen as we lead up to the unification of Germany. We're going to talk about the unification of Italy. We're going to talk about nationalism in France and literally the second empire in France and stuff like that under Napoleon III and stuff like that. But we need to wrap up before we can do any of that. All this scientific stuff that's going on in Europe during this time period, right? So let's go ahead and keep picking up right where we left off in class, talking about the Second Industrial Revolution. So we discussed the Second Industrial Revolution in class, talking about smaller interchangeable parts, electricity, and how a lot of this stuff is coming off the heels of the laws of thermodynamics being created and actually kind of categorized in the late 1800s, right? Or like in the 1800s following the revolutions of 1848. We can now look at machines and we can now try to figure out how do they work? Where does this energy go? How can we take this one thing and then make it even better? Things like the telegraph that was invented by Samuel Morse comes along, which gives you the ability to send messages over great distances with great speed. The processing of rubber, petroleum distillation, gasoline, and the creation of the internal combustion engine, right? So just to give you a heads up, every one of you drives to school with an internal combustion engine every single day, which is, of course, a gas-powered car, right? So the big thing about it, though, is internal combustion engines are a lot different from a steam engine because they just have a very much like what's the word I'm looking for? Conservation of energy. They actually are very efficient when it comes to conserving energy, using it to power a vehicle and stuff like that. They also don't break as often as steam engines, and they don't require as much big machinery. They can also be very small, and they only need about a few cylinders to be able to run, but this is going to big important thing, increase the demand for gas and increase the demand for rubber. Now, the thing about it, though, is let's go ahead and look forward into time. Where are most of this stuff? Gasoline, rubber, where's all that coming from? It's not coming from Europe because they don't have access to it. Rubber grows on a certain type of tree that grows predominantly in Africa and Southeast Asia. Gasoline comes predominantly from the Middle East and also like parts of Africa and also areas of like South America as well. So what's going to happen a little bit later on in the 1800s is we're going to see the growth of imperialism, right? Europeans going to these places and using their military to take over so they can steal and take these resources, right? So going into it, we will talk about that a little bit later on, and that'll be in the next unit, right? So railroad transportation is going to increase. Iron steamboats are going to increase. The Bessemer process and the production of steel. The Bessemer process is the thing that we talked about actually yesterday a little bit, where they learned how to actually use a furnace to heat iron to higher rates than it had ever been heated before, and it actually is going to burn out all the impurities and leave behind a metal that is flexible and stronger and has a greater tensile strength than that of iron. And another big thing to just kind of understand about the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, is just the idea that like lingering machines got more efficient and just got a lot better. This right here is, of course, George Stephenson's rocket, the one that was the very first locomotive ever created. And then this right here is the like late 1800s locomotive that will be more efficient, use steam more effectively, and also even include transportation cars and will be used to move people as well as goods throughout these different countries. Now, continuing off of that, though, you're going to see a couple of big scientists pop up as well in the back half of the late 1800s that are all going to be very important, and they're also going to analyze a lot of different things. You got some people that are going to be social scientists. You got some people that are going to be like science scientists. You got other people that are going to be evolutionary scientists. So the thing about it, though, is they all kind of actually were inspired by the Second Industrial Revolution or contributed to it in one way or another. So the two guys that we're about to talk about in this part of the scientists and stuff like that in the scientific movement of the late 1800s, first and foremost, is Dimitri Mendeleev. Some of y'all know exactly who that is because you've had Miss Rivette and you've actually talked about this in chemistry. He basically is the father of modern day chemistry. He discovered the periodic laws and created the periodic table that you know of today. What does this lead to? It leads to the analysis of very important things in chemistry, like atomic weights, bonds, the setup of electrons, and also how like actual atoms are probably set up and used in energy, and also chemistry would later be subdivided into new branches like organic chemistry and also the study of carbon compounds of life. So Dimitri Mendeleev is going to contribute to the growth of these things by analyzing these different chemicals, understanding where they go, and understanding what reacts with what, so they can actually make more machines more efficiently. Now, another real guy that's really, really important is a man by the name of Michael Faraday, right? So, So, there you go. Faraday. Faraday is extremely, extremely important because he's going to discover the base laws of electromagnetism, right? Electromagnetism in the sense of how can we bump electrons, valence electrons, on the outside of certain atomic bonds to actually create a release of energy that we will direct and you consider electricity, right? Now, some people always get this a little bit confused, right? They're always like, well, I thought Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity. No, he realized that there's electricity in lightning, right? The thing about Michael Faraday is he came along and realized that you can create electricity using a very, very simple machine that he created known as a dynamo, right? This right here is a dynamo, all right? Let's talk about what this thing does. This right here is a copper disc. These two things right there are magnets, right? And so actually right here is a receiver, and there is a wire connected to the receiver, and it directs the flow of electricity. So what happens when you actually spin this thing, the magnets themselves actually wiggle the outside valence electrons on the outside of the copper atoms. Now, the interesting thing about copper is it has not one, not two, not three, but 10 valence electrons on its outer shell that are very easy to bump onto other like different compounds and then also to move around in terms of bonding, right? The thing about it though is if you have 10 valence electrons that are very loose in these bonds, they can actually easily be moved, and all it takes is a few magnets to bump them around a little bit. And when they bump, a little bit of energy is released. If you collect all that energy in this receiver and channel it through a wire, you got electricity. And you got electricity that you are creating at will. Now, right here, his original dynamo was used a hand crank, right? You would actually go like this, attach that bad boy to a steam engine, though. You have modern power plants like we have today, right? This will lead to the creation of the electric streetcar. It'll lead to the creation of so many other things. It'll even later on, in the later 1800s, lead to the creation of lighting in conjunction with Thomas Edison's work to create lighting and lighting systems that will also be used in the very, very big current wars when it comes to AC and DC current. You'll talk about that actually next year a lot whenever you get into U.S. history, when you talk about how like the U.S. scientists, Westinghouse, Tesla, well, Tesla's technically Polish, but like so Westinghouse, Tesla, and then also how Edison competed against each other to see what they could figure out the dominant force of electricity and how to use electricity, alternating current or direct current, right? Now, also speaking of as well, you're going to see companies pop up because of these different things. For example, Bayer is an actual like chemical company that existed in southern Germany, and it was created based off Dimitri Mendeleev's ideas. And you're going to see the growth of all these different groups and groups of people, like the Krupp family from Germany, who is going to be the biggest weapons producer that the continent has ever seen. And what am I getting at, though? We got a German company and another German company. That means the Germans are industrializing very, very quickly. And this is going to freak out the British significantly. Oh, by the way, you're also going to see the growth of cities like Manchester. Now, this right here, why it's very important, is because with the growth of all these things by Faraday, Mendeleev, and all these other figures as well, you're going to see the growth of production of factories in different areas, and you're going to see the growth of international business. This right here is the Ford Motor Car Company, which is an American company, and they had a very, very, very large factory in Manchester, England, right? That produced a ton of those classic Model T Fords, right? So you're seeing the growth of international business on the back end of the Second Industrial Revolution as well, okay? Now, there's another guy that's going to come along who's more of a sociologist, right? His name is Auguste Comte, right? Auguste Comte, his background was he had a very mixed background in general, actually like worked underneath Henri de Saint-Simon, the guy that was a socialist and stuff like that, that actually created French utopian socialism, worked under him, but they had a falling out and stuff like that, and he began to write very, very avidly about the growth of society past religious and moral values, right? So the big thing that Auguste Comte realizes as he comes along as a sociologist, he believes that the Second Industrial Revolution, the achievements of Mendeleev and Faraday and stuff like that, are showing the regular community that maybe religion isn't as important as it used to be. He's actually probably one of the most prominent atheist scientists that has ever existed in the late 1800s, but he comes along with this idea known as the positivist method, right? Positivism or positivist method is the idea that only valid information can be taken from scientific observation, right? So he's setting a new standard in the late 1800s that talks about how scientific observation is the only way to know anything for sure. And he says that basically, if you track through human history, you can see the growth of proof positive scientific information go through three distinct phases in society, right? He postulated the idea of learning on a societal scale, starting off with the theological step. And the theological step means we base all of our ideas on religion. If you look actually, for example, at early Judeo-Christian as well as Roman and Greek polytheistic religions, they all had certain beliefs that like the earth was in the middle, the sun went around it, and that the gods had something to do with that. Mainly just due to the fact that their observation skills were very limited and they were just looking into the sky and it appeared as though everything moved around us, right? Then we went to the metaphysical phase. The metaphysical phase was like where there's a mixture of science and religion, right? Where like Copernicus is issuing de rev and the church is saying, no, that can't be true. And there's this very, very mad dash for trying to figure out what's going on. And then you have the scientific phase that started with Galileo and also Newton using mathematics and observation to prove the setup of the universe, right? And now we know that the sun is actually this, like the stationary object. Well, it's technically not stationary, but that's neither here nor there. The thing in the middle, and then everything else goes around it, right? So using the setup of the universe on Auguste Comte's positivist method is actually pretty proof positive, right? Now, social sciences are going to continue to grow off of the ideas of Auguste Comte, and it's going to take the objective ideas of science and they're going to start applying them to society, right? So sociologists and social sciences is the idea of taking the aspects of experimentation, observation, and creating large data sets to try and understand society a little bit better, right? Now, there's a lot of people in these different societies and in these different time periods that you could argue are major social scientists, right? Now, the thing about it is, though, is like these can have great things that do great things for great people, right? For example, the massive amounts of data by the mid-1850s that were on crime, children, death rates, educational value, all these other different things are providing massive sets of data for governments to use to pass laws that can actually better help people, right? You'll see this especially with Napoleon III. You'll see this especially with the growth of the welfare state and things like that in Europe during the 1800s and also going into the 1900s, right? So this massive amount of data and the use of scientific observation on society is going to have huge benefits. Now, another example of like social science or scientists is going to be like Karl Marx is going to take these ideas and say, oh, capitalism is failing. Well, we know that's not true, i.e. look at where we are now, 2023, and capitalism's still killing it pretty much. You know what I'm talking about? The big thing about it, though, is that Marx is going to take these similar ideas of these rates and stuff like that and try to apply them to his own theories. Now, there's a time period, though, and we need to get very, very clear about this, where social science should not be mixed with certain sciences, right? So why I'm bringing this up is because we're about to talk about really quickly about Darwin and evolution, right? Now, all of you apparently know so much about Charles Darwin and his theories on the origin of species and natural selection, right? Judy Merrill, praise be, she's the best. She made sure that she taught you all this stuff about natural selection, the strongest survive, and the creation of the modern world as we know today with its organisms actually being in competition with one another, right? So the thing that we need to understand though, okay, I love that you know that, this of course being a picture of Charles Darwin when he was very young before he wrote The Origin of Species with the HMS Beagle in the background, and he's on the Galapagos Islands with the turtles and the finches and all that fun stuff, right? So the thing about it though is, just so you know, he actually wasn't the first one to come up with this idea, right? There was actually a French scientist that came up with him before. It was like Leclerc or I can't remember what his name is ever, but it starts with an L. He came up with it first, but he had no scientific observations to use. So Darwin went on his expedition and observed all these different animals and their evolutionary patterns and how different species have different sets of evolved traits to actually compete and survive in their local areas given certain adaptive immunities or traits, right? So the thing about it is, though, is that Darwin is going to issue this idea of evolution, and it's going to be met with a lot of mixed reviews. Now, early on in that metaphysical stage that Auguste Comte was just talking about, right, people are going to look at Darwin's ideas and they're going to be like, no, you're taking God out of everything. We refuse to believe this. Whereas the scientific community begins to say, well, these ideas are pretty much proven at this point by just using observation. The thing about it, though, is so you're going to see a lot of mixed reactions to his stuff, right? Some people are going to say this is a terrible idea. Some people are going to say it's a great idea. Now, the other big thing about it, though, as well, is that as his ideas begin to gain popularity, his ideas would be used in very disgusting ways, right? And evolutionary theory would be used to try and actually talk about why imperialism was okay, and it was called social Darwinism, and it's absolutely wrong, and it's ridiculously racist, all right? But we will talk about it, of course, a little bit later on in the next unit when we talk about imperialism and how Darwin's ideas were taken and twisted and made into really, really stupid ideas, and a lot of it is because of Darwin, because he actually made it even worse. Now, going into it, though, as well, we got one last scientist to talk about before we move on to France and we wrap this whole thing up, and this is going to be an obscenely short flip for y'all because we just don't have that much to talk about in this flip, right? So the thing about it, though, is we're now getting into Sigmund Freud, right? Like, so now, have any of y'all ever heard of Sigmund Freud before? Yes, no, maybe. Sigmund Freud being the very, very famous Viennese psychologist, right? So now, like, he is Viennese, he's from Austria, right? So, like, born in Austria and stuff like that. Born before the revolutions of 1848 and doing most of his work in the late 1800s, okay? So the thing about Sigmund Freud is he goes in a whole new idea, right? He takes the social sciences of observation and begins to apply them of how it affects our minds, right? And he began studying mentally ill patients and believed that all adult problems are born from childhood, because he created this thing called psychoanalysis, or psychoanalysis, right? Psychoanalysis, including the idea of using sedative states and using sedative ideas to try and allow a person's subconscious to come out and prove to the person that past events and past expectations and past ideas and past struggles are actually affecting you as a person today. It's the thing of therapy that we know most best. Laying on the couch, allowing yourself to talk, being in a sedative state, being comfortable, and also analyzing things like dreams and the ideas of your subconscious and subconscious urges and wants, right? And he said that basically a lot of this comes from the constant attempt to repress everything, right? He also created this thing called the Oedipus complex, which we'll talk about a little bit in class, which is a little weird about how all of you are kind of secretly attracted to your parents, but we're not going to get into that right now. So the other thing about it is he also created this free association of ideas, and he used hypnosis to try and actually allow the psychoanalyst process to work a little bit better. He also prescribed ridiculous amounts of cocaine to people as medicinal use, which I'm talking ridiculous amounts of the stuff. It's absolutely insane. And then also on top of that and everything else, he also created a psychoanalyst perspective where there are three parts of the human brain. He said that basically you have your id, your ego, and your superego, right? According to Freud's theories on the ideas of the id, the ego, and the superego, the way he actually portrays it is that your ego is your person, right? It's your thing that you present to society. It's who you are on the streets, right? When you're talking to somebody, when you're interacting with somebody, that is your ego, discussing between the old cartoon adage of that devil and the angel on your shoulder, who are your superego and your id, right? So now look, your ego, that putting out there, has to grapple with these two things that are pulling you in either direction, right? So your superego, according to Freud, is the one that's all about your morals, right? The things that you were taught, religious backing, religious value, the ideas of like what is right and what is wrong, and trying to fare on the idea of right by society. Your id, on the other hand, is your animalistic urges, your primal subhuman things, right? Your wants to fill certain desires like food or sustenance or safety and things like that. And you have to struggle and grapple with these things all the time. And if they are out of balance, it leads to psychotic problems, right? So the thing about it, though, is we'll talk more about Freud in class. Maybe we'll psychoanalyze one of y'all or something like that, which will be a really, really good time. What's your relationship like with your mom? So now going into it, though, as well, we're now shifting gears completely, okay? We're shifting gears, and we're going to start moving into a new unit, or not a new unit, a new theme of nationalism, right? We're now going to be talking about nationalism and the growth of nationalistic states during this time period in the late 1800s, and we're also going to begin to discuss the unification of certain areas, right? So speaking of that, the first thing we got to do, or first thing we got to understand, is that nationalism being this new ism of the pride in your people, pride in your country, believing that everything has a certain genius to it in the sense of your culture, can appeal to both liberals and conservatives, okay? It can be both very radical or very liberating. Liberalism really likes it a lot. Conservatives can get down with it. Ironically enough, socialists don't like it that much, right? Because they feel that working people have no country, right? So the thing about it, though, when we're looking at this whole thing, is that idea is going to spread very, very quickly. And in the era of nationalism in Europe, you got three major players you got to keep tabs on, right? You got France, who's already a nationalized country, but they're going to be major players. You've got Italy, who's going to unify, and you've got Prussia that's going to unify the German states into Germany, right? So the thing about it is, let's start off with France, right? Let's go ahead and talk about that, get a little bit of a handle on where we are in France, right? So France, the last time we checked on them, is underneath the rule of Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, who are the same guy, right? So like if you hear me use these names interchangeably, it's the same dude, okay? So also, we're not going to worry about this thing right here. We're going to skip over that. We're going to skip over that. We're going to skip over that, okay? So now the big thing about it, though, is we'll talk about that stuff a little bit in class. We'll talk about how, like, the progression of French politics went from, like, the French monarchy to the French First Republic to the French First Empire to the French Second Republic, and then now we're moving into the French Second Empire, right? So the thing about it is Napoleon III, though, ruled from 1848 to 1870, right? Now, a big question that I had on the last slide is why him and who did he appeal to, right? Well, why him is a big one due to the fact that, like, he was very famous, right? He had a lot of clout behind him. He was Napoleon III, elected in France's Second Republic, mostly due to the fact of his uncle, right? His uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, being the person that led France to glory and victory in the empire phase, is going to be the thing that grows his reputation and gets him a lot of very, very large amounts of clout in this entire era, right? Now, he went through a lot of crazy stuff in his life. He lived in England for a little while. He tried to invade France at one point. It didn't go really well and stuff like that. But he finally realizes that the revolutions of 1848 are his moment to strike, and he returns back to France, and he actually enters into the presidential election, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is what's really, really entertaining about this election is there were two guys on the docket, right? There was Napoleon III, a.k.a. Louis Napoleon, and then there was Eugene Colignac, right? And Eugene Colignac was uber conservative, crazy intense conservative. Napoleon III will be considered a moderate by comparison, right? He understood the needs of the liberals. He understood the wants of the socialists, and he understood the fear that the conservatives had of change, right? So the thing about it that he actually realized is he was like, I need to capitalize on the fact that these two groups, conservatives and liberals, are afraid of a growing socialist or Marxist idea, and also I'm going to issue popular programs that will appeal to everyone in pamphlet form, right? So he began to distribute pamphlets and ideas and campaign all over France, and as you can see, it was wildly successful. The darker the green, the more votes that went for Napoleon. He received almost 74% of the popular vote, and as you can see, Eugene Colignac only got Marseille and the areas in northwest France. And he also issued tons and tons of political cartoons and advertisements and newspapers to try and get his name out there, and this right here is his very, very famous pamphlet that he issued during his presidential election called The Extinction of Pauperism, where he tried to pledge the idea that I'm going to eradicate poverty in France, right? And as you can tell, he's using that name recognition right here, right? It's Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, right? So, and the idea that he wants to create a better France. And you can see that in his reforms with Haussmann and in the programs that he created, right? Now, there were a lot of high hopes going into his reign of a strong moderate like Bonaparte, someone who could advocate for all people and stuff like that, who could try to actually create jobs for socialists to keep them from drifting towards the Marxist idea or from a violent realm, who could create different things to create working class people that will actually create more money and opportunities for classical liberals and keep the wheel and the machine of France rolling forward, right? Now, the thing about it is, though, is that at this time when he came to power, the legislative body in France was called the Chamber of Deputies, right? And the Chamber of Deputies was filled with mostly conservatives, right? It was filled mostly with conservatives that were very afraid of giving up any power because they were afraid of anything like an 1848 happening again, right? So what Napoleon has to do is he has to come in and he's got to placate them a little bit, right? Now, to placate means to keep them happy, okay? And he's doing it for one particular reason. He comes in, though, and he says, okay, fine, look, conservatives, how about this? I'll increase the role of the Catholic Church in education to try and create more like Christian moral value in education and stuff like that. It'll keep people from revolutionizing and whatnot. I'll do that for you conservatives. And then also, I'll limit suffrage even more than it already is, right? I'll like really put a handle. I'll rein in these like suffrage rights. And I'll try to figure out ways to take some poor people's voting rights away. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it. And he does actually strip some voting rights away. Why would he do this, right? A lot of it has to do with a thing called term limits, okay? So something you need to understand is Napoleon had a term limit, right? He could only rule for so long as president before he actually had to step down and another election would happen, right? Because this is now a Republican-style government that's in France. It's the French Second Republic, right? So the thing about it is he was hoping that the conservatives would like him so much that they would pass and ratify a new constitution so he could rule for longer. But unfortunately, the Chamber of Deputies kind of like really went the other way and did not write a new constitution to give him a second term. So what would a Napoleon do in this? He would throw a coup d'etat, right? So in 1852, only 4 years after the Revolution of 1848, he throws a coup d'etat just like his uncle did, and he got and some middle-class rebels in protest and because of some middle-class protests and rebellions that happened during his coup d'etat, when he used the military to overthrow the Chamber of Assemblies, he actually re-granted universal male suffrage, and 92% of people elected him president for the next 10 years, right? And then later on, about a year later, when that when another constitution is rewritten again, they elect him emperor, right? And a lot of this is following all of his welfare programs, right? All of his redesigning of Paris, all of the new construction, all of the glory. Nationalism is a driving force, right? The thing about it is French people felt even more proud to be French under Napoleon III and the programs that he was helping to try and keep everyone happy. But the thing about it is we've now entered into the French Second Empire, and there's one issue about trying to keep everyone happy, right? When you try to make everybody happy, you're going to have mixed successes and failures, okay? Because big thing about it that Machiavelli said is, you got to be feared or loved, right? Or excuse me, you should be feared and loved. If you got to pick one, you got to be feared a little bit, right? And that doesn't really come from trying to keep everybody happy, right? So the thing about it is his biggest successes is going to be the economy, right? He is going to have a booming economy in France, mostly due to the fact that he's going to do certain things that are going to happen before 1860, right? Now, the thing he's going to do is he's going to build railroads that are going to make industrialism on the continent possible. Corporate banks are going to issue limited liability loans that are going to make everything very, very efficient and even easier to construct railroads and move new products throughout France and also throughout the continent itself. He's going to hire housemen, redo Paris, rebuild those roads, do the ring boulevards. He's going to also realize that unemployment is declining and wages are rising along with inflation during his economic standings because he's creating these socialized programs that actually are going to employ the socialists themselves, and he's going to use that to pacify the urban workers, right? These different programs he's creating are keeping those socialists that would otherwise possibly become Marxists happy, right? And he's allowing also them to strike and form unions. He's giving them more rights, right? But then right around 1860, everything kind of goes sideways, right? Because some things are going to start happening. Italy is going to go into several wars. They're going to start trying to unify. Prussia is going to reignite this old German-French rivalry, and liberals and conservatives are going to kind of split, argue with each other, and then blame Napoleon for a lot of these issues, right? And then also, democracy with universal male suffrage is starting to meet head-on with pretty chaotic times, right? Because the fact about it is like when things go sideways, who does everyone look to blame? They look to blame who's in power, right? So they end up blaming Napoleon, and his rule does not actually last for as long as you would think. He's pretty much done ruling over France by 1871, right? Becomes like emperor in 1853, doesn't even last 20 years, right? So the thing about it, though, is we'll pick right up on that stuff when we get back in class. I'll see y'all soon, and we'll move into the unification of Italy. So I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.